Good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of you. My name is Daniel Bekele. I am the Chief Commissioner at the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. And this is a joint press conference of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Eastern Africa Regional Office, on the joint investigation by the two institutions into the human rights situation of the Tigray Conflict. On my right is Mr. Marcel Akopovo, who is representative of the High Commissioner and the head of the East Africa Regional Office for OHCHR. And then next to Marcel is Charles, and next to my left is Charles from OHCHR and Albab Tesfaye from the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, who are the co-team leaders of the joint investigation team. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of Ethiopian Human Rights Commission commissioners in the room, as well as both the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN colleagues and some of our partners. The report we are launching today is prepared in English, but I would like to say that the Amharic and the Tigrinya language, the translation will also be made available in the coming days. As you would see, this press conference is also organized in English language, but if anyone wants to ask a question or speak in Amharic, please by all means feel free to speak and ask your questions in Amharic. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the crew, the members of the press corps, the joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is a culmination of preliminary discussions between the two institutions on how to respond to the human rights situation in the Tigray region following the outbreak of the conflict in early November 2020. These discussions led to a formal request from the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to conduct a joint investigation on the human rights situation in Tigray, which was accepted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the objective of this joint investigation included, among other things, accurately documenting human rights violations by all parties to the conflict, furthering the accountability process and advocating for effective remedies, providing clear, actionable, and gender-sensitive recommendations, and identifying serious violations to ensure redress for victims and prevent recurrence of similar occurrences in the future. And prior to the commencement of our investigation, the joint investigation team agreed on its method of work to guide its investigation, consistent with the practice of international fact-finding bodies. It has adopted various methodological approaches, including the adoption of a reasonable grounds to believe standard of proof for factual determinations of incidents and occurrences. The investigation was carried out within the framework of international human rights law, humanitarian law, refugee law, and relevant national laws of Ethiopia. The joint investigation team conducted field investigations from 16th of May to end of August and investigated alleged violations by all parties to the conflict from the 3rd of November of last year, 2020, until the time of the unilateral ceasefire declared by the federal government and its withdrawal from the Tigray region, which was end of June. The joint investigation team carried out investigations in Mekelle, in Wukro, Samre, and nearby areas in Samre, in Alamata, in Bora, Maicho, Dansha, Maikadra, and Humara. The joint investigation team also interviewed internally displaced persons from various parts of Tigray, including Adi Aro, Adi Haragai, Adigrat, Adwa, Badime, Dangolat, Humara, Korem, Maikadra, Mekelle, Kiha, Shimalba, Shire, Shiraro, Temben, and Zalambassa. We have also further conducted investigations in Addis Ababa and other affected locations such as Gondar and Bahar Dar in the Amhara region. The findings in the report rely primarily on first-hand testimony from victims and witnesses, and written material provided important context in some instances to corroborate interviews. As such, the Joint Investigation Team conducted a total of 269 confidential interviews with victims and witnesses of alleged violations and abuses, and it held 64 meetings with federal and regional authorities and representatives of the UN agencies and NGOs, community groups, medical personnel, and other sources. This report does not in any way purport to be an exhaustive record of all relevant incidents that occurred during this period, but it fairly and reasonably illustrates the main types of and overall patterns of violations and abuses over the period in question. Based on the information gathered and analyzed by the Joint Investigation Team, there are reasonable grounds to believe that all parties to the conflict have committed major violations and abuses in the context of the conflict, including: 1, the Ethiopian forces, the Eritrean forces, and the Tigrayan forces. I just want to do a quick reminder that in the report you would find, and in my presentation probably, you would find that we would be using a lot of acronyms. So ENDF is for Ethiopian National Defense Forces, EDF is for Eritrean Defense Forces, and TSF is for Tigrayan Special Forces, and ASF is for Amhara Special Forces. So, as I was saying, all parties to the conflict have committed major violations and abuses in the context of the conflict, including, I would list some of them as an example. Number 1, the ENDF, EDF, and TSF carried out attacks on civilians, resulting in the deaths and injuries of men, women, boys, and girls, civilian objectives which enjoy special protection under international humanitarian law, such as health facilities, schools, places of worship, and houses were indiscriminately attacked. Parties to the conflict failed to take sufficient precautions to protect civilians and civilian objects. For example, 29 civilians, including 3 children, were killed in Mekelle due to shelling by the ENDF on the 28th of November of last year. On another example, between 25 and 27 November of last year, an undisclosed number of civilians died in Wukro due to exchange of artillery between ENDF and TSF, and several private and public properties were also damaged. And 15 civilians were killed between 9 and 11 November of last year in Humara due to artillery shells fired by EDF and TSF, which is the Eritrean forces and the Tigrayan forces. Number 2, the Ethiopian forces, the Eritrean forces, and Fano, which is a group affiliated to the Amhara militia, and the Tigrayan forces and affiliated militia, and a group called Samri, a local Tigrayan youth group, have committed unlawful killings and extrajudicial executions amounting to violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And persons taking no direct part in hostilities were willfully killed by parties to the conflict. A majority of these killings targeted young men. For example, in one instance, an ethnic-based killing of more than 200 Amharas, mostly men, in Maikadra by Samri, which is a killing by a group called Samri, and the Tigrayan police and militia on 9 November, as well as retaliatory ethnic-based killings of Tigrayans by the Fano. In another instance, the killing of more than 100 people in Aksum on the 28th of November of last year by the Eritrean forces. And in another instance, the killing of at least 70 men in Bora, Amdoha, Bora Jamala, and Mailiham by the ENDF on the 8th and 9th of January of this year. The Ethiopian forces, the Eritrean forces, number 3, the Ethiopian forces, the Eritrean forces, the Tigrayan forces, and allied militia and Tigrayan police committed acts of torture and ill treatment against civilians and captured combatants in various locations across Tigray, including in military camps, in detention facilities, in victims' homes, as well as secret and unidentified locations. Some of the incidents in chronological sequence include: 1, for example, from 9 to 10 of November of last year, Tigrayan militia and armed civilians in Humara arrested and detained mostly ethnic Amharas, whom they insulted with some ethnic slurs, which you will find in the report. They beat people with plastic pipes. They kicked and denied food and water for several days. In another instance, in March of this year, in Samra and Brazba, Eritrean forces subjected victims to torture and other ill treatment. And the ENDF committed acts of torture and ill treatment in Bora in December of last year. Number 4, the Ethiopian forces, the Tigrayan forces and allied groups, and the Eritrean forces engaged in several arbitrary detention, abduction, and enforced disappearances. For example, in Tigray and other parts of Ethiopia, predominantly ethnic Tigrayans were arrested by ENDF and the federal police for perceived affiliation with the TPLF and kept incommunicado for long periods without formal charges or legal proceedings. And in Western Tigray, Tigrayan forces detained civilians mostly of Amhara origin, starting from the 9th of November of last year, for perceived support to the federal government, and took them to Shire, Aksum, and Mekelle, some of whom were killed or disappeared. Number 5, various acts of sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, gang rape, intentional transmission of HIV virus, were committed by all parties to the conflict. Women and girls whose male family members were Tigrayan combatants were targeted by the EDF, the Eritrean forces, and wives of the ENDF, the wives of the Ethiopian forces soldiers, were similarly targeted by the Tigrayan forces for sexual and gender-based violence. Sexual violence has profoundly violated the survivors' physical, psychological integrity and caused serious health complications, particularly the gang rapes were characterized by their brutality. The Joint Investigation Team also obtained reports which implicated the Amhara Special Forces in acts of sexual violence. Number 6, other human rights and humanitarian law violations, including against refugees and internally displaced persons, were also documented. The Tigrayan forces and the Eritrean forces violated the civilian character of Shimelba refugee camp, and the fighting between the Tigrayan forces and the Eritrean forces around the refugee camp resulted in the destruction of the camp, the displacements of thousands of refugees, and the disappearance of hundreds. Some refugees were forcefully returned to Eritrea by the Eritrean forces, and the TSF, the Tigrayan forces, is reported to have looted private properties of the refugees and property belonging to humanitarian organizations. Number 7, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled their homes in Tigray at different intervals. The Tigrayan population in particular was significantly affected by forced displacement in western Tigray. The forced displacement of ethnic Amharas from their homes by the Samri Youth Group with the support of the local administration in Maikadra in November 2020 was followed by a widespread retaliatory forcible displacement of ethnic Tigrayans, mainly in western Tigray, by the Amhara Special Forces, by the Amhara militia and Fano. The displacement caused by different groups has also exacerbated the existing tension between mainly Tigrayans and Amharas in the area, where they once lived together, and which might prove to be a challenge in efforts to return IDPs in safety to their previous residences. Number 8, children were subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, physical injuries, and in some cases killing as a direct result of the conflict. They were exposed to traumatic experiences such as witnessing the killings or rape of close family members by soldiers of the parties to the conflict, including the EDF, ENDF, and TSF. The displacement and killing of their caregivers left children orphaned and vulnerable to further violation and abuses. Number 9, parties to the conflict also are also implicated in violations against older persons and persons with disability, including killings, injuries, and sexual and gender-based violence. Number 10, the report details incidents of large destruction and appropriation of property across Tigray by different actors, including armed forces, militias, civilians. The report also highlights limitations to freedom of movement and freedom of expression, access to humanitarian relief, and other violations of economic, social, and cultural rights. Therefore, the Joint Investigation Team has reasonable grounds to believe that a number of these violations may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes, which require further investigation to ensure accountability, and the primary responsibility for addressing the violations rests with the state as part of its obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. Now, before I invite my colleague Marcel to present the summary of our recommendations and his own remarks as well, I would like to conclude my part by saying that I would like to thank the victims, the families, and other witnesses who shared their experience in this investigation. I would also like to thank all members of the Joint Investigation Team and various experts from both institutions who undertook and supported this difficult but very important mission. And my appreciation also for several of our national and international partners and non-governmental entities who provided various types of support throughout this investigation. And finally, I would like to thank the government of Ethiopia for demonstrating the commitment and support for the joint investigation, as well as offering a positive response for the final report. As you will see in the report, the federal government has expressed its reservations on the specifics of certain incidents, but we are encouraged it has accepted the overall findings and recommendations of the report and stated that it is committed to remain engaged with the findings of the report and take the necessary steps to provide redress for victims, ensure accountability, and rehabilitate communities and areas that have been affected by the community, and affected by the conflict. The government has further stated that it will give special attention and emphasis to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and that it will also take the necessary reform measures to strengthen its mechanisms and procedures that are meant to prevent the occurrence of such incidents. Therefore, I would conclude by saying that the conflict in Ethiopia expands with more reports of violations and abuses. I sincerely believe that this report presents an opportunity for all parties to acknowledge responsibility and commit to concrete measures on accountability, redress for victims, and the search for a sustainable solution to end the suffering of millions. I thank you, and I pass it to my brother, Marcel.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone, and all protocol observed. I want to to say a very sincere thanks and express appreciation for your presence with us here this morning. And also on behalf of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, acknowledge the presence of some of our colleagues here. Sorry, my voice wanted to go. The presence of our colleagues, our investigators, from both the National Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and then the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Allow me also to thank Daniel and then complement his detailed presentation. I will later on mainly give you the summary of our recommendation, but before then, I just wanted to offer some thought and some reading from OHCHR perspective on the report. Probably there may be some repetition because Daniel has been very extensive, but all the same, I believe that it's never good. It's never bad to do good many times. Our joint report with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has today laid bare the terrible toll on civilians of the conflict in Tigray from early November 2020 to until 28th of June 2021, as Daniel mentioned, when the government of Ethiopia declared a unilateral ceasefire. Indeed, and based on what my colleagues, my partner, have said, we have indeed a reasonable ground to believe that during this period, all parties to the Tigray conflict have committed to varying degree violation of international human rights, humanitarian, and then refugee law. Civilians in Tigray have been subjected to brutal violence and suffering. And the joint investigation team uncovered numerous violations and abuse, including unlawful killings, extrajudicial execution, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, violation against refugees, and then forced displacement of civilians. I'm not going into those details because Daniel has already given you a lot of such. Civilians indeed paid and continue to pay the heaviest price. But I want to talk to you about stories. I want, in the frame, in the context of what he's described as a finding, I want to talk about, just randomly picked from so many testimony that we've been able to collect, I want to talk about the family of 4 people killed in Aida, in Mekele, as their house was shelled reportedly by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces without any apparent military justification. I want also to talk about the 26-year-old woman in Adyet who was gang raped reportedly by Eritrean Defense Forces soldier in front of her 3-year-old daughter. And then I also wanted to talk about the man in Maikadra attacked with machetes, reportedly by the Samri Tigrayan youth group, shot in the back and thrown in the fire. The war continues with this egregious testimony that we've been able to collect across the board. And every day, more people are suffering and are dying. It is vital from our perspective that all parties heeds the repeated calls to end hostilities and seek the lasting ceasefire. As ever, there is an urgent need for a serious inclusive dialogue with the genuine intention on all sides to reduce tension, avoid more civilian suffering, and find peaceful solution. As he mentioned earlier, we embark in this joint investigation at the invitation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to enable our teams to get first-hand information on the facts to allow us to provide a faithful account of the situation in Tigray and to assist in ensuring accountability and peace. The report, as you can see, is not an exhaustive record of all violations and abuse that occur during the conflict, but it fairly, and I'm very strong about that, illustrates the main type and overall pattern of violation and abuse. We are, again, and I want to repeat it again, grateful to the many victims and witnesses who share their experience and to others who provide pertinent information. Their voices speak in the pages of this report. From information collected and analyzed, the report, the joint investigation team has, and he has indicated already, very reasonable ground to believe that a number of these violations may amount to crime against humanity and a war crime, which require further investigation to ensure accountability. The primary responsibility for addressing the violation rests, of course, with states as part of its obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights obligation. And before I give you the recommendation, the summary of them, I will want really very specifically to amplify here what victims and survivors of violation conveyed to our joint investigation team. What did they tell us? They told us that they want their means of livelihood restored. They told us they want a reparation for their destroyed homes and all they have lost. They told us they wanted to know the truth about what happened to their loved one, for all sides to acknowledge their role in the suffering they have inflicted to them, and for the perpetrator to be brought to justice. That's what they told us. It is indeed in listening to those voices from the victim and survivors that among many other recommendations, the report outlined the following recommendations. Parties to the conflict should agree without precondition to immediately end hostilities, enabling each space and then to be open toward achieving a sustainable and an inclusive peace. The state should ensure prompt, comprehensive, and an effective investigation by independent and impartial body into allegations of violation of international law, international humanitarian law, refugee law, domestic law, and hold perpetrators accountable. The states should initiate a victim-centered and gender-sensitive reparation scheme that includes restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, including the right to the truth and guarantees of non-repetition. The international community should support initiatives to strengthen justice and accountability for serious violation and crime, including effort by the Ethiopian authorities to investigate and prosecute perpetrators for violations of human rights, humanitarian law, and refugee law committed within the context of the conflict in Tigray. The state of Eritrea should investigate violations committed by its forces and hold accountable those implicated. A key concern of our report is due accountability, as you can see. National authorities, as I say, have the primary responsibility to deliver fair and independent proceedings that address the full range of violations identified and not isolated individual instances. And if authorities, national authorities and national mechanisms are not in position to do so, an international independent investigative mechanism should be considered. It is therefore very crucial that the government of Ethiopia and Eritrea ensure that those responsible for serious human rights violations are indeed held accountable regardless of the affiliation of their perpetrators. I would like to end my thoughts and then keywords by offering very simple, certainly a common knowledge for everyone in this room, which is related to the conflict, but about Ethiopia and the role Ethiopia plays in the regional context. Ethiopia is a key country in the region. There's no doubt about it. I just wanted to reiterate here again something that we have been saying all the time, that a prolonged crisis in this country could be a very disastrous situation for the regional stability, for peace and security. And this is not just a concern to Ethiopians, to Tigrayan, to everyone affected by this conflict, but it is a reality that concerns the whole of the East and the whole of Africa. I want to leave you with those thoughts that we are all in together, and the voices that we are offering today is a voice of solution. It's a constructive voice that could help allow each and everyone be part of a process that ensure accountability for the wrong, but also use accountability process for a sustainable peace conversation that could help Ethiopia to remain together and the people of Ethiopia to be safe and to live safely. I thank you.